Module 10, Timed Feeding. In this lesson, we'll examine the effects of time-restricted feeding. That can refer to intermittent fasting. It can refer to restricting food intake to a certain number of hours per day. Or in the case of my lab, it can refer to restricting macronutrient intake of given meals in a very directed and thoughtful way. So we basically did a series of studies to do a breakfast of champions. Is this high carbohydrate breakfast that's low in fat better or worse than this high fat breakfast that's balanced with protein? And so I'm going to walk you through a series of studies that we've done to test this idea. There are several nutritional truisms that you've probably heard many times. Things like breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Eat breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, and dinner like a pauper. Eat breakfast alone, share lunch with your friend, and give dinner to your enemy. And don't go to bed on a full stomach. And all of these truisms refer to the idea that maybe the early meal, the waking meal, is the most important meal, and that a later meal should either be shared or minimized or skipped. From the published literature, we have known that individuals who don't eat breakfast tend to have an increased BMI and a greater total daily caloric intake compared to breakfast eaters. So basically, several studies have shown that people tend to make up those mixed calories and then some if they skip breakfast. It's been reported that consumption of a carbohydrate-enriched breakfast has been associated with reduced caloric intake later in the day. And it's also been reported that night eating syndrome is associated with a higher BMI. We wanted to set up an experiment that could balance the calories because despite a clear time of day dependence for the reported observations, total caloric intake is typically considered to be the primary cause of why you see differences in BMI. One of the reports that came out of Fred Turek's lab was these data here that said restricting high-fat diet consumption to the inactive or sleep phase. In the case of mice, that's when the lights are on because these mice are nocturnal. If they just gave food to these mice during lights on, when the mice are supposed to be sleeping, what they saw was incredibly increased weight gain and impaired, despite the fact that they ate about the same calories, and impaired metabolism. So we wanted to test this aspect of the studies. Rhythms in fatty acid and glucose metabolism, we know, occur at different times of the day. So we've done lots of experiments in our labs looking at normal rhythmicity of things like triglyceride synthesis on the right, or whole body resting metabolic rate on the left, and basically show differences throughout the day in terms of fuel utilization. So we did a series of studies where we compared the macronutrient content of the food and when it was given. The food in this case is literally the yellow food, the low-fat food is yellow, the high-fat food, which is 45% calories from fat, is pink, and periods of fasting are represented by bars that are white. So in the first conditions, sets of animals were either given ad libitum access, so continued access to either high or low fat food, and we compared those animals, and those were the controls. Then we had a series of studies where we compared whether or not they got high fat in the light or in the dark. So these are nocturnal animals and they're normally active during the dark phase, and we wanted to see whether or not giving them different kinds of food would make a difference. Then in this third series, we restricted food only to their active phase and compared ad libitum high fat versus low fat, but restricted to the active period. And we also did a set of experiments where we had a high-fat meal at the beginning of the day or a high-fat meal at the end of the day of the waking active period, with low-fat available all the rest of the waking period. Or in the final set of data, we actually compared meals that were high fat or low fat at the beginning of the day paired with the opposite kind of meal at the end of the day and separated by a period of fasting. To evaluate the animals in this study, we recorded daily food intake, we recorded weekly body weights, and then at the end of the study, we collected all kinds of data to establish glucose sensitivity and body composition and energy expenditure in terms of whole body calorimetry. And we did a whole bunch of assays using tissues and samples collected from these animals. Now, this is a comprehensive laboratory animal monitoring system, which is a very, very fancy feeding system. And actually, when we were at Baylor College of Medicine, we ended up getting a feeding system just like this. But at the time of this study, the feeding system was us, the laboratory, and this little plastic feeder. And literally for more than a year, me and my lab took those feeders in and out of 80 cages 4 times a day. We put them in the morning, took them out 4 hours later, put them back in 4 hours after that, and took them out 4 hours after that. And you can imagine, it was a lot of work, but the results were pretty exciting. So these are the data that resulted from the ad libitum fed animals. And keep in mind, these were the controls. So what you would expect is that animals that eat high fat eat more calories and gain more weight. And that's exactly what we saw. So this is food intake over the course of the day in kcals, but this is total food intake in this upper right-hand corner. And what you can see is that the animals that are eating ad libitum high fat are eating a lot more calories. And at the bottom in panel B, you see they weigh more. In panel C, they have higher body fat. And in panel D, they have poorer glucose tolerance. And that's exactly what you'd expect to see in animals eating high fat compared to animals eating low fat. The control animals, in summary, 12 weeks of ad libitum high-fat feeding resulted in weight gain, adiposity, glucose intolerance, and hyperinsulinemia and hyperleptinemia, as you would expect. Here's the effects of the animals when they're given either 12 hours of high fat combined with 12 hours of low fat, or 12 hours of low fat combined with 12 hours of high fat. And what we saw in these instances, interestingly, was that calories were absolutely balanced and weight gain was balanced as well. So combining the day and breaking it up into periods of high and low fat seemed to even out the effects that we saw in the ad libitum animals who were fed continuously one type of diet. So pretty interesting because the animals don't eat a lot during the lights on period. And one set of animals was eating high fat and one set of animals was eating low fat in their active period. And but yet they look exactly the same in terms of glucose tolerance and body fat and body weight. And in fact, animals that were limited to either high fat or low fat, but only in the active period, which is very comparable to the set of data that you just looked at, they again didn't eat any different in terms of calories, maybe slightly higher in terms of fat, but not significantly different. And their body weights were not significantly different, and their glucose tolerance was not significantly different. And this is consistent with lots of observations made that suggest that animals eating the same kind of diet all day long are good at figuring out the calorie density of the diet and basically adjusting their food intake to the calorie density. And if you look in the top middle panel, top left panel, you can see that in terms of food consumption, the animals eating their high carbohydrate meals are balancing absolutely over the course of the day their calorie consumption. So in summary, for active phase feeding, 12 weeks of continuous high-fat feeding during the active phase had little or no effect on body weight, adiposity, or glucose tolerance. Now here's where the data start to get pretty interesting. In these conditions, just to recall that the animals had either a high-fat meal at the beginning of their active period followed by low-fat at the end, or they started their waking period with some low-fat food and had a high-fat meal at the end of their waking period. So what we saw in this case was that animals who had this high-fat meal at the end of the day actually ate more calories, gained more weight, gained more fat, and had worse glucose tolerance than the animals who had that high-fat meal at the beginning of the day. But we were worried that the effects we were seeing, again, like the human studies, were simply because they're taking in different amounts of calories. But it's interesting that breaking up the day with mixed meals actually results in these differences in caloric intake, where eating the same thing all day long resulted in no differences between the animals in these conditions B and C. So that might suggest that having mixed meals or meals with different compositions of food may be one reason why animals and maybe humans can't discern total calorie intake because of the non-uniformity of the meals they're taking in. So to control for calorie intake, we did one final condition. To control for total caloric intake, in this final condition, what we did was we gave the animals two 4-hour meals, either a high-fat meal at the beginning of their waking period combined with a low-fat meal at the end of their waking period, or just the opposite pattern where they started the waking period with a high carbohydrate meal and ended with a high-fat meal. So the meals were separated by periods of 4 hours of fasting. And what you see in the top panel, panel A, in the top right-hand corner, is the total food consumption. And basically, there was no difference in caloric intake between these two sets of animals. No difference in total fat, fat, carb, or protein. So intake exactly the same. In panel B, you can see that the animals who ate their late high-fat meal, just like in the previous condition, had the greatest body weight gain. In panel C, they had the greatest body fat. And in panel D, they had the greatest glucose intolerance. So same exact calories, but different times of the day in which they ate them. We actually repeated this experiment 4 times, and by the time we were done with it, every single person in my lab was eating sausage biscuits and eggs and bacon because we were convinced that the day should start with a high-fat meal, and I'll show you the best evidence to support that. So the summary of these results were that the late active awake high-fat feeding resulted in weight gain, adiposity, glucose intolerance, and I didn't show you the data, but they also were hyperinsulinemic, hyperleptinemic, and hypertriglyceridemic, and they had metabolic inflexibility. What does that mean? So here is a scale of RER, resting exchange ratio. And if you'll remember, an RER of 0.7 is indicative of a person or an animal burning almost completely fat for fuel. And an RER of 0.1 or higher is indicative of burning almost completely carbohydrate. So this is these are animals in the metabolic chamber over the course of 24 hours. And what you can see is the late high-fat meal in red and the early high-fat meal in black. Let's follow the black tracing for a minute. From time 0 at the bottom there to time 12, that's when lights are on. That's when they have no food, and that's when they normally sleep. So when you sleep, your body goes into beta oxidation, and you can see RER going way down, and that by the end of your sleeping period, your body is pretty much just burning fat. In the case of the early high-fat meal, RER goes up a little bit because there's some carbohydrate in that meal, so they're no longer burning just fat. But when they go into that 4 hours of fasting period in between the two meals, their RER immediately starts to go back down, back into beta oxidation, and when they're given that high carb meal at the end of the day, their RER goes right back up to metabolize the carbohydrates appropriately. Now let's look at the red tracing. In the case of the red tracing, again, the animals are going into beta oxidation like they're supposed to during lights on when they're asleep. And when they're given that high carb meal, their RER goes way up to just above 1, and that's appropriate because they're eating a very high carbohydrate, high simple sugar meal. But the interesting part of the story is that when they're then given that 4 hours of fasting in between those two meals, they don't have any sign that they're going into beta oxidation. And in fact, when they have a high fat meal at the end of the day, they're still burning mostly carbs, which means they're mostly storing fat and burning carbs. And this picture of metabolic inflexibility associated with an early high sugar meal is actually would explain all of the other metabolic parameters that we observed. So pretty exciting, and we continue to test this model in different ways. So what we showed in a next series of experiments is that this effect happens pretty quickly. So even as early as day 1, you start to see a little bit of this pattern of inflexibility in these high carb fed animals. And by day 9, you're seeing almost no tendency to go towards a fasting period of beta oxidation. And then, of course, day 84 is what I just showed you. So we repeated that experiment just to show what are the acute effects. And it looks like this high carbohydrate meal acts acutely to turn on carb metabolism, and the animals have a really hard time turning it off. So in conclusion, the time of day at which carbohydrate versus fat is consumed markedly influences multiple cardiometabolic parameters. We have later since repeated this experiment in humans and shown this similar type of metabolic inflexibility associated with a very high carbohydrate breakfast waking meal.